Hi, and welcome to ShadowTalk's weekly intelligence summary track, where our team of analysts dive into the top threat intelligence stories each week. To read their full findings and analysis, make sure to visit resources.digitalshadows.com. Now here's your host, Harrison Van Riper.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to ShadowTalk, your weekly threat intelligence podcast. I'm your host, HVR. We've got a really good show this week. It's pretty timely, too, with the anniversary of GDPR happening on Saturday. Our Chief Innovation Officer, James Chappell, sat down with data protections and privacy lawyer James Boyle from Taylor Vinters, a law firm who focuses on supporting technology-rich businesses and the entrepreneurs who make great things happen. Mr. Boyle has led privacy compliance projects for global behavioral advertising networks, cybersecurity businesses, and technology retailers with online and physical stores across the UK. James is a self-described technology geek and very nearly about to move into the woods if any more data breaches happen. So it's a really good discussion centered around data privacy and the effects of GDPR, so be sure to stay tuned for that. So first up, we have our weekly intelligence roundup. So joining me are some of my illustrious UK colleagues, Phil Doherty and Jamie Collier. How is it going, fellas?
Yes.
I just like being, described as illustrious. We should make that a thing.
Yeah. Where did that come from? That was
the illustrious JC Cool.
Exactly. Yeah.
It sounds like a title for like a really good like 50s fantasy novel.
I think we just need to keep adding more superlatives. So it's.
Yeah. You look
a
like
new one each week.
As well, don't you?
I am, I am. I am a kind of middle-aged man.
All right, so with that excellent introduction to the illustrious JC Cool. All right, so first up this week, Philly D, you are up for the main story, which is all about this RDP vulnerability that has everyone freaking out, CVE 2019-07-08. I just saw last night, actually, that Malware Tech on Twitter dropped a Python proof of concept to exploit it. So please do tell me more.
Yeah, we'll do. So it's much more of a technical report this week. Like you said, it's on a remote code execution flaw that Microsoft released a patch for. So it's titled Blue Keep by some people out there. So it's the vulnerability that affects Microsoft's remote desktop services. So for those who might not know really what a remote desktop service is, it's just a way to connect to a separate device remotely over any connection. So if I wanted to connect to like Jamie's or Harrison's computer from London and they were away, usually I need permission for that, but what he doesn't know isn't going to hurt him. So I have a list of systems that are vulnerable to this exploit before we go into it, just in case anyone's still using them and didn't realize. So it's Windows 7, Windows Server 2008 R2, Windows Server 2008, Windows XP, and Windows 2003. So the title of the report that we pushed out this week was called Keep Calm and Patch the CVE. So yes, it's a stressful vulnerability, but it is easily mitigated by updating the patch that Microsoft released. But essentially with this flaw, a threat actor who has access to a vulnerable system could remotely send unique requests and execute arbitrary code on any device. So if we imagine a threat actor decides to inject or deliver requests calling for self-propagating malware, this becomes a bit of a problem. Because in theory, I suppose it could move laterally to other devices that utilize sort of an equally vulnerable operating system. So it wouldn't be difficult for a threat actor to gain initial access to these systems either. So one feature of remote desktop services is that they would need authentication or permissions to get into it. But this one is a pre-authentication flaw and an automated vulnerability where there is no user interaction. So we see phishing and spear phishing all the time, and even simple spam messages with a malicious executable could harvest credentials for a threat actor to gain initial access and then start to exploit this flaw. So I think it does highlight, again, how automated social engineering and this increase in sophisticated initial access methods can be coupled with something like this to really cause a serious problem. So we've talked a lot about the increase in efforts by threat actors to create an automated kill chain, particularly in the last few weeks and last months around social engineering attempts. And I think this example isn't really any different. It's really just carrying on this trend, carrying on what we've been talking about. So this flaw in particular, it's been described as potentially facilitating the next WannaCry level attack. But I don't know, sort of as a patch has been released, it is the user's responsibility to update affected systems, and the mitigation is there for people to utilize. If unpatched, it could be self-propagating, but me personally, I don't think it's going to reach that sort of level. Do you?
I don't know. It's hard to say, but I think there's going to be a lot of people there that haven't patched. But how critical will those systems be? You'd have thought a lot of those systems would have learned the lessons from WannaCry, so it really just remains to be seen.
Yeah, that's a good shout. A very good shout.
Yeah, I think actually also kind of to bring up the point of WannaCry, like people are still getting infected with WannaCry, right? So that might lend kind of more credence to why people are sort of afraid of it, right?
Yeah, it's definitely it's like the biggest name in cybersecurity, WannaCry. So it is like we definitely recommend, like, to prevent this level of exploit happening, just go patch Microsoft's update. But it does have a potentially critical impact, especially as the affected systems are not even supported by Microsoft anymore. They're quite old legacy systems, but they still decided to release this patch and update for it. So some of these systems will get automated patches and hot patches, but those who don't should definitely take the steps to identify whether they need to be manually implemented or not. So at the moment, you touched on it earlier, Harrison, there are several proof of concepts flying around, and claims to sort of have been successfully found ways of exploiting it, posted on social media, but not actually taken advantage of by a threat actor yet in the wild. But this level of flaw will likely draw attention from threat actors, and it could be leveraged soon. So this is why it is important to stay on top of patching procedures and security responsibilities, because even sort of these old systems, and like you were saying again, the whole point around WannaCry is still going around. People might have thought that died out, but it can still pose sort of like a credible threat. So obviously everyone's concerned of the worst case scenario, but there are legitimate concerns over sort of smaller remote access attacks. So a threat actor could attempt to identify a vulnerable remote desktop protocol server just by simple queries over Shodan, or they can just make up their own little script and find out. And even if your remote desktop protocol is offline, sort of third-party suppliers and infrastructure providers, they might have theirs online. So you don't know what the route could take. And if you did turn it online and it was directly linked in, then that could be a problem for you as well. So we always worry about the big threat, but the multiple smaller scale ones, they're just as much a problem here. So for us, what's the next step? Patch it is my straight up answer. So make sure it's patched. Then we can all go back in peace of mind. But there are some other things to watch out for. So these fraudulent claims of proof of concept, I think, are quite interesting as well. So because they're on social media as well, they're going to start drawing in a bit of attention, and possibly even people trying to get out and contact them. Maybe to try and entice them if they're trying to get money, saying okay, I have a possible attack vector here, or I have a full proof of concept. You're going to pay me for this. And it could just be complete nonsense. So you've got to just watch out for those sorts of things. And I do think attacks attempting to exploit it will be reported soon. But I think it's too early to talk about sort of the potential impact that it could have.
All right, that sounds great, Phil. Be sure to go check out the full intelligence summary where you can read all about this at resources.digitalshadows.com. And so let's move on into the highlights for this week. JC Cool. Oh, sorry, the illustrious JC Cool.
There we go.
You're up. Yeah, you're up first. The first highlight from this week is MuddyWater. The Iranian threat group was observed using a new obfuscation technique.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a campaign been referred to as Blackwater that's been linked to MuddyWater, as you say. So, a lot of water going on, a lot of hydration. So MuddyWater, they've been quite active. They've actually really become one of the most prominent Iranian groups, especially in the Middle East region. As for this Blackwater campaign, happened in April 2019. We don't know too much about the targeting, but there were the kind of various techniques used to evade detection. So one thing is that the Trojan used masqueraded as a red team utility. In terms of the enumeration commands used, they were actually derived from an open source GitHub project. This allowed the threat actor to prevent outsiders from monitoring their activity by checking web logs for server requests, etc. I think with this incident, it's important to put it into context, as we recently saw a number of leaks related to Iranian state groups. And that actually included earlier this month a leak that was claimed to be based on MuddyWater data. So this was put out for sale, although the legitimacy of this data wasn't confirmed. So important to note that this campaign, being in April 2019, occurred before those leaks. So it doesn't actually tell us anything about the leak, i.e. if the leaks caused disruption to MuddyWater or if this was a reaction, none of that is the case. However, I think what it does show is that the group kind of is continuing to develop its capability. It's adding those new tactics, those new techniques. So you would think that if that leak was legitimate, it's probably going to have a minimal impact as the group, is just so active at the moment in developing their capability.
All right, cool. Yeah, super interesting. All right, so let's go on to the next update. We've also got some Trickbot updates or new stuff that they're doing. Tell me more.
That's right. So Trickbot adopted a URL redirection technique. So they sent these spam emails masquerading as a package delivery document, and the URL had a Google domain containing a new link that led to a kind of fake order review site. So it redirected to a kind of a zip file containing the Trickbot downloader. So this isn't really a new technique. Actually, we've kind of seen it many times before. But what it really does show is that those kind of classic tricks can still get you. Redirection URLs are a really effective way to bypass filters that either block messages containing suspicious URLs or web browsers that, web browser filters that whitelist certain kind of trusted URLs. So I think it's kind of indicative of a broader trend that we see in the cybersecurity industry, where we get very excited about the cutting edge and the new techniques, the APTs. We often think that we need these kind of shiny toys and new products. But actually, a lot of the time, the threats are repetitive and they're easily preventable if you're following those kind of simple steps, as kind of Phil already mentioned. With the Microsoft vulnerability, it's just about patching and keeping things updated. As for mitigating these redirection URLs, organizations advise to simply configure browsers to block those kind of offsite redirects. And also for kind of Digital Shadows clients can find the indicators of compromise related to this incident in our portal.
Excellent. Then finally, we've got some sad news for a lot of MongoDB instance owners. Tell me the tragic news.
That's right. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, Harrison, but over 12,000 MongoDB databases were wiped, so these were kind of publicly accessible. Interestingly, no ransom fee was demanded, so the threat actor, going by the name Unistellar, instead provided an email for victims to get in touch if they wanted to restore their databases. So, quite interesting there that they didn't provide a ransom fee up front. Possibly so that a fee could either be negotiated or maybe adjusted based on an affected victim. I think given the number of databases picked up, the scale means that this was likely automated. So it's not clear that Unistellar had an idea of what was picked up, what it's going to do. So at the moment, it kind of seems like the main thing is this kind of extortion, providing people with recovered databases if they do pay up. But it might be that as Unistellar starts to kind of assess and understand what they have, we could see other actions. So some reporting that came out after the incident mentioned some of the data in the databases obtained is quite valuable. One database reportedly had the personal identifiable information belonging to over 275 million Indian citizens. So there's a realistic possibility that in addition to kind of offering to restore or this kind of extortion campaign, that Unistellar might also harvest or sell this data on as they kind of understand what it's all about.
It's just savage, just erasing everything. It's just so rude.
I know.
Savage Dark Overlord.
Yeah, exactly. All right, and that will wrap up Threat Intel. Next up, we have our interview with the Jameses coming up, and then followed by that, we have the question of the week, so stay tuned.
All right, welcome to the Shadowcaster podcast. And we're here to talk about general data protection regulation and what's happened in the last year. I'm James Chappell. I'm co-founder and Chief Innovation Officer of Digital Shadows. And for my sins, I'm also a data protection officer. And I'm delighted to be joined today by James Boyle from Taylor Vinters. James, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, James. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm a senior associate in the commercial technology team at Taylor Vinters. My main focus is on all things data protection and privacy. Main kind of business we work with, fast growth technology businesses and the entrepreneurs that work behind that. Client base generally is global, but our offices are in London, Cambridge and Singapore.
Fantastic. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. So I guess it's, general data protection regulation, pretty much everyone's bored stiff of all the marketing that's sat around this topic. It's if you try to avoid it, it was basically impossible. On the 25th of May last year, we saw this European regulation come into force. I'm sure there's plenty of good articles you can read about what the GDPR is, but I thought what we'd focus on today is, a whole year has elapsed since the introduction of this earth-shattering regulation.
Yeah,
I think I thought we'd spend a bit of time exploring, what has happened since then, and whether or not what was said to come to pass actually has. So maybe a good place to start there is we've general data protection regulation. If you believe the marketing hype, we'd all be lying dead in the streets. There'd be flames around us. We'd have, it was basically the privacy Armageddon that was going to hit the world, and everybody was going to be fined 20 million euros, and you better get on top of it quick. From your perspective, has that actually happened? Are we in that place?
So great question. Thankfully, no. So one of the things that I thought was really surprising about the GDPR was that we actually had the regulator in the UK for data protection, which is the Information Commissioner's Office, issue a series of blog posts aimed at busting myths, because there was so much misinformation going around about what the GDPR actually meant from a practical perspective that the regulator had to step in and say, look, the law is changing. It is going to be significant, but not necessarily in all of the ways that people are panicking about. The immediate thing that comes to mind is at the practitioners conference last year, the ICO said that if you would have been fined, say, £20,000 for a breach under the old law, if the same breach happens post GDPR, that fine won't necessarily increase from the £20,000. So the law was never about an excuse to increase fines for low-level breaches. One area in particular that I think would have affected probably everyone listening to the podcast will be the re-permissioning emails. So those were the emails going around sort of April 2018 where everyone was saying, if you still want to hear from us, we can no longer contact you unless you click here. That was one of the biggest myths, and because you simply did not have to send those emails generally. In some cases you did, but the vast majority of them being sent were not necessary. And we've now seen, since the dust has settled, commentary on the sort of website of the body that regulates solicitors in the UK, saying that actually there's potential negligence claims here for people who are being advised by professionals in a panicked way to send out these emails trying to get consent because it was simply over-engineering the issue.
It's fascinating, isn't it? So I've seen the term GDPR certified enter into the vernacular over the last 12 months. And we've seen sort of people sort of saying, look, you've got to be certified by the ICO to be a sort of a GDPR compliant house. And actually, it seems to be a little bit more soft than that, doesn't it?
Yes.
There's shades of grey in privacy.
Yeah. Obviously,
some very important blacks and whites as well. Very very important parts of the discussion too. So it's from that perspective. So is this stuff really working? I mean, in the UK, I mean, all of the different countries in Europe had their data protection laws before the GDPR came in.
Yeah.
You've just said, the fines are kind of in a similar zone, although, maybe the cap has changed slightly. Aren't we just in the same situation we were in before?
So I would say no to that. I think that's probably the biggest impact the GDPR has had, because people, I think, are more aware of their data rights than they've ever been. Although I've just said that the fines weren't necessarily going to be increased hugely just because of GDPR, I think that the threat of a much larger fine has made lots of organizations more aware about the seriousness of data compliance. I think generally compliance is still a mixed bag these days, but I'm seeing a lot of businesses who have really gone through a kind of step change in their compliance. They are taking this very, very seriously. One of the things that I was quite pleased to read about on the train this morning was the New York Times Privacy Project. There was a conversation along the lines of, we've heard that data is a new oil. That's been around for years, but we're now potentially moving to a situation where the erosion of privacy is the new climate change if data is a new oil. And I like to think that this kind of...
Strong words.
Yeah, completely.
Right.
And in a sense, I like to think that this like mindset shift has, in quite a large part, been sort of arisen as a result of these new legislative changes that we're seeing in the GDPR and similar laws coming in the States.
So there's sort of a privacy activism amongst consumers that perhaps didn't exist there previously.
Absolutely.
And people are sort of a bit more aware of what their rights are than maybe they were before.
Completely. Yeah.
Right, interesting.
Particularly because if you take the ICO in the UK as an example, they ran a campaign in the lead up to GDPR called Your Data Matters, which is an area of the website completely dedicated to explaining to people what rights they have under the law. And there's almost a sense of irony here because you have all of these organizations irritating people by trying to comply with the law by emailing them. And if anything, that has also served to pique people's interest. And actually, what should these businesses be doing? Because this is irritating me and I want to do what my rights are.
Right. Interesting. So they're sort of, people are exploring those their rights now and becoming aware.
Yeah, 100%. I'd be interested to hear about how you've seen it affecting Digital Shadow's business as well.
Yeah, so I guess it's really important that we've had to think about both in terms of marketing and making sure that the way that someone who's got data on the internet could inquire about our services and how they relate to that data. And of course, our customers care, deeply as well about their privacy. And in fact, I've just prior to this came out of a now every contract negotiation has a data protection agreement negotiation as well, which fortunately I have to say is becoming much more standard over time. I think when we first started this, there's about 25 different versions of data protection agreement contracts, and now luckily, most people are simply restating the law or just being very practical about it because there's only so much time in the day to look at this stuff. So I think feels like it's bedded in a bit when we're sort of doing contract negotiations and sort of understanding things. I was really intrigued actually by the subject access requests area. In fact, I believe you and I were chatting a couple of days ago about people are building whole mobile apps for where consumers can, submit subject access requests at scale across a series of consumer-based organisations. So I'm trying to remember the name of the app we were looking at.
It was Tap My Data.
Tap My Data.
Yeah.
So this was pretty cool. So if you've even got a little bit of European blood in you, go download this app. It was a really fascinating exercise. You sort of go in, you type into the app all the companies that look after your data, and it will send a subject access request to the data protection team at that organisation, and it will do it. You submit one request, and it will distribute it to thousands of different consumer organisations, and then you win a mug or a pen or something related to it. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. Yeah. So you're a keen user yourself.
Yeah,
James,
for sure. So one of the things that I really, really like about what has happened in privacy innovation over the last 12 months is that it is being made much, much easier to exercise your data rights. And I think this is quite an interesting angle because the law was obviously coming in to encourage organizations that hold people's data to make it easier. That hasn't necessarily happened, but what has happened is there's now a whole range of third parties who thought, actually, there's a really good avenue for us here to facilitate this. So it isn't actually the business holding your data themselves that are doing this, but there's a whole new sort of type of third-party organization along the lines of a tech startup that are doing this for you.
Incredible. So not only are people more empowered, there's now sort of privacy at scale, or privacy as a service to assist people in submitting their requests.
Completely.
So I guess, it's quite interesting. I guess this probably affects organisations that serve consumers perhaps more than it would affect a B2B organisation, but certainly worth being aware of if you've suddenly got to scale up your... I was shocked slightly to hear that charities were a bit of a target of those applications, and of course charities don't have a lot of resources to go and respond to stuff like this. So scaling that out's interesting, isn't it? So if privacy is the headache, is there an aspirin or a paracetamol or a Tylenol that we can take to solve it. I mean, we've seen a lot of marketing. Have people been able to go out and buy solutions that make this problem go away, or are we actually finding this is much more sort of embedded?
I love that question. And I think there's a nuanced answer. So from the organizational perspective, there are hundreds of platforms that are now designed to help you prove that your organization is, let's call it GDPR compliant, or takes privacy seriously. Generally, those platforms record what you've done. They don't do it for you. So I think the short answer to the question is no, there isn't an aspirin, but there are lots of software tools that record whether you've taken the aspirin.
Right.
But ultimately, the legwork is still very much for those working within the business to do. And in a way, I think that makes sense, because a lot of the data protection laws are quite weird. Because in the UK, we're very used to laws that say something like, if you're going to drive on the motorway, you cannot drive faster than 70 miles an hour. But we don't have that under the data protection law. What we have is an equivalent of, if you're going to drive on the motorway, you have to drive at a safe speed. The question that lawyers and DPOs are left with is, well, what the hell does a safe speed look like? And part of that, I think, has to be driven by customer feedback, what's practical and works for the business, but also an assessment of what the market's doing. I know, for example, that you've worked through some kind of privacy angles there, so it'd be really good to hear about those in a bit more detail.
Well, I guess from our perspective, we've always taken showing that the spirit of what you're doing is in the right place, so that we've gone out and consulted, we've gone out and got the right things in place, and that we're confident in what we're doing because we've asked all of the questions and thought about the answers to it, and proactively registered and discussed that with the authorities at the appropriate points. So that's a really it's very interesting. I like the speed analogy. That's definitely true, and I think it certainly resonates with me. I also there are information security has had this challenge in some regards for a long time. We've landed up with certifications like the AICPA SOC standards, if you like a bunch of acronyms, that's one of them, or there's the ISO 27001 standards here in the UK, or indeed things like Cyber Essentials here in the UK. There are schemes that cover the security bit of that, but we're still lacking, it seems, something in the privacy space at the moment. So
I'm really glad you raised that, because about 3 or 4 months ago, the ICO issued new security and encryption guidance. And what I thought was really interesting about that is they started to pull through concepts that have previously been reserved for the cybersecurity industry. So we now have data protection regulators talking about the confidentiality, integrity, and availability triad. They talk about how you should be salting password hashes. They talk about vulnerabilities, I think, in SHA-1 and MD5. Whereas I think 18 months ago, you wouldn't have seen privacy or data protection regulators talking about this. So I do think the lines between cybersecurity and what you might traditionally think is the privacy and data protection group is blurring. And I think that can only be a good thing.
That's interesting. So they've got a tricky balance, of course, as well, because if they're too prescriptive and they say, well, this is the absolute set of controls you must implement, and then that turns out that organisation gets breached, then where does the liability sit in that discussion? Of course, they can't take on the liability for the entire world. So that's a sort of interesting balance, I guess, there that we'll see evolve over time. I guess one of the other things that's been quite interesting from my point of view is looking at internationally how this is all sort of panned out. So obviously Europe has been quite a active space in terms of privacy, but we're seeing the likes of Singapore. So Singapore has the PDPA. We've seen Australia with the Australian privacy principles. We've seen sort of the USA, even at state level, California coming up with the consumer privacy laws as well. So it's, it feels like if you're a global organisation, this is starting to get quite complicated.
Yes, completely. So from what I see day-to-day in practice, the GDPR is still considered to be the gold standard. One thing that often surprises the sort of international businesses we deal with is that the GDPR applies in basically two ways. One is if you're based in the EU handling data about people, it applies. The other is even if you're based outside of the EU, if you're still handling data about people in the EU, the GDPR applies to you. For some of our US businesses that we're working with, that was a real shock to them. But I think that kind of is generally referred to as having extraterritorial application. But I think that has been really useful in terms of educating the international businesses. The other thing is, so when you're going through a negotiation with these businesses, you say the law applies. The natural next question is, well, what does that mean for our contracts? And when you take them through what the law requires in these contracts, it's things like you will make sure it's secure. You won't transfer it to other people without letting us know first. When you actually explain it to them, they say, oh, well, most of that makes total sense. And it often isn't that difficult to negotiate them in. So a lot of these principles that are introduced under the GDPR are flowing down across the globe because they make sense. Particularly when you couple this with a growing demand from these organizations' customers that they want to know what is happening with their data and they want reassurance that it's being held securely. So it all kind of knits together in this global patchwork of privacy.
But so I guess, for me, it's fascinating to see this is a continuation of what we did before.
Yeah.
What's really nice, what I like about it is it encourages people to ask the security question more frequently, and boards seem to care more about it because it's sort of in more contracts, and it's the numbers in the contracts are bigger numbers, so it seems to gain more attention for that reason. Yet it does seem like we still have a bit of balance. It hasn't gone. We aren't in the flaming bomb pit of GDPR where the giant bomb landed and we're all sort of frazzled and covered in soot. So which is good. So
how have you seen the security conversation change? Both sort of in the old area, say 3 or 4 years ago, compared to where we are now. How are your conversations different?
It's hard to unpick whether this is caused by GDPR or not, but one thing that I have noticed is the level at which conversations around security happen is now higher level, and the types of people that you have that conversation with tend to be more senior in the organisation. So we now have boards really caring about digital risk, cybersecurity, and privacy issues in a way that we perhaps didn't do sort of 4 years ago. I think to solely say that was solely GDPR, I think would probably be over-egging it somewhat, but it certainly helps. And for me, I've just got more reasons to help customers see why securing information is a good idea. That's a good thing, right? That's not a bad thing. I think probably also some of the slightly more ambiguous bits of GDPR are actually quite helpful because it gets them out of the compliance-driven approach of just ticking a couple of boxes into what is the risk of something bad happening, and how do we manage that risk, which is a much more healthy discussion. And also, actually, the other thing I think it's done is we've gone through that conversation about security and resilience. So versus like the worst will never happen to me, to we're definitely going to have breaches. How do we respond and recover to them? I think that's again a much healthier way of looking at the problem. So I think I wouldn't lay all of that GDPR is the reason that all happened, but it's certainly helpful, and I think it's a big contributing factor to the way we've seen some of the discussions with customers change. So
great. Really
interesting. Okay, so a couple of other sort of interesting things. I've got some stats here. So if you've not seen it before on the IAPP's website, there is a infographic which has GDPR 1 year anniversary. If you go and Google for it, you should be able to find it. Some quite interesting stats on here. So over 56 million euros in fines to date. So actually just back to that point about, it's not everyone getting 20 million euros unless there were only sort of 3 fines. So so clearly, it isn't 20 million euros every time. It's quite interesting. In the UK alone, We see about 32,000 DPOs in the UK, 182,000, interestingly, in Germany, and across Europe, about 375,000 data protection officers. So these are the, where your organisation deals with a lot of data, you need to have a data protection officer. One of the really interesting things I saw here were on notifications and complaints. So across the whole of Europe, there are 64,000 notifications. So this is where an organisation has been breached and they're going proactively to the regulator and saying, hey, we're just letting you know some records have been lost. These are the circumstances. Here's what we're doing to fix it. So what do we think to that number? Is that a high number? Is that a low number? Does that seem right?
So I think it's a significant increase from where we were before, because under the old regime, you didn't necessarily have to report a breach. You were encouraged to. You didn't necessarily have to. I think this is an area where everyone is panicking. So they think if I have any kind of data breach, I need to, as one of my clients puts it, go and grass myself up to the ICO.
Right.
But I think it's quite easy to forget here that it doesn't apply to every data breach. When we're talking about whether you have to report to the ICO, it's about personal data, so data that identifies living people. And then even then, you generally don't have to report if you can show that the breach doesn't bear any kind of risk to those individuals. What I think is quite telling is that on the ICO's website, when you go on to the breach notification section, there is a sentence in bold on the first page that says you do not have to report every breach. And they encourage you to go through their own self-assessment tool that helps you work out, actually, is this a breach of the kind that I need to report? I think this is an area where the myths overtook the reality.
Right.
I think we are slowly walking back from that because the ICO actually ran their own webinar trying to educate people around, like, these are the kind of breaches you need to report, these are the kind you don't, and then they've now have this self-assessment tool.
But on the flip side of all of this, right, so we've got, right now, so we did a bit of research called Too Much Information. There's 1.5 petabytes of business documents just sat on the internet.
Yeah.
Out there. And then, there's a guy called Johnny Long who wrote a book called Google Hacking. You can go onto Google and type in confidential, not for distribution, file type XLS. Yeah. You can get a bunch of Excel spreadsheets with, probably names, addresses, email addresses, that kind of thing in there. And there's tens of thousands of those. It strikes me that maybe what's actually where privacy is failing on things that do contain personal information, not all of them are getting reported. And it seems to me, and I don't think I'm being overly this isn't hyperbole. I do genuinely think there is a difference between what's already out there versus what's getting notified.
Yes, I completely agree with that. I think one of the problems we have is that businesses don't always know what's out there. But one thought I've got on this is, do you think the individual has a role to play? So let's say that I interacted with a company, say a coffee shop, and it turns out that their marketing list with my email address is searchable on Google, but it also has my purchase history of coffees. So you can work out that I really like the caramel syrup in my lattes. My view is that it's arguable that actually I have a role in protecting my own privacy. So I could, for example, I could put my name into Google using those kind of search queries.
Right, okay.
Maybe that would pull that up. So I wonder if there's a discussion to be had more broadly with the ultimate aim of protecting individuals' privacy that recognises that everyone has a role to play in this.
Right.
And it is very easy to beat organisations. I don't in any way want to give the impression that I think the coffee shop shouldn't be responsible for this. I think it's important to recognise the power that we'll have as individuals, because a lot of these search tools are available to us and they're quite easy to use.
Well, it's quite, we talked a little bit about people taking matters into their own hands, and the IAPP's anniversary infographic here talks about 94,000 plus complaints being made. So it feels like we're only just getting going in terms of complaints. Like we talked a little bit about the apps earlier. That's really just getting going, it seems, and people are becoming enlightened about the questions they can ask, and where they can go with it.
There's a lot of innovation in this space designed to protect individuals' rights, and I think that's a really good thing. Even when we look at the new sort of privacy-friendly browsers that are coming in, like Brave and DuckDuckGo, which is designed to sort of protect privacy when it comes to things like mobile ad tracking and cookies, I think that can only be a good thing.
We talked a little bit about notifications. We talked a little bit about the sort of number of complaints, but what do we really think is happening there in terms of organisations complying? I very strongly recall on May 25th last year that we had organisations who were taking a wait and see approach.
Yeah,
to see what happens. So are they still waiting and seeing, or are they actually proceeding with? Have they sort of seen what they needed to see and cracking on with it?
So I think it's a typical lawyer's answer, where it's very non-committal and kind of says it depends.
It depends. We do that in security too, just by the way.
Then,
so
I'm in
not
good
alone.
company, which is good to know. I think you can loosely categorise how people have approached it. So you definitely have those businesses that said, look, this is a really good chance for us to sort things out in time for the 25th of May last year. And they pretty much got there. You definitely had another category that said, do you know what? We're going to wait for some fines and see where the real pinch points are, who's focusing on what, where it's going wrong. The main way that I've seen those organisations affected is they have had more individuals questioning them because they've been querying, actually, your notices on your website are out of date. You have all of these random tick boxes that I now think are non-compliant. Can you tell me? And those organisations that have adopted a more of a wait-and-see approach, it's not necessarily being led by who's being fined for what, because we don't have that many decisions yet. But it's absolutely being led by customer queries and people challenging. I find now people are much more willing to fire an email off to an organisation and say, what are you doing? Like, I didn't sign up for this email. So change is being driven from the customers rather than a compliance angle per se.
Actually, interesting. So we're obviously a business. We buy services from other businesses. I was very interested. There was one supplier that we were considering last week where I asked them for their privacy policy, and then they pointed me to someone else's privacy policy. And I was like, hey, I'm just a little bit confused here.
Yeah.
Whose privacy policy is this? They went, oh, I'm sorry, we didn't copy it correctly. We just give us a minute, we'll just copy it and then put it on our website.
Yeah.
And I was like, and I'm not placing a contract with you. So
completely. Yeah.
So it proved to me that they really didn't have much of a clue, and there was no way, since I have to notify our customers of any sub processes or folks who are processing their data, there's no way I'm going to put that in front of one of our customers.
No. So the market is 100% adjusting in lots of different ways. So even if you haven't been driven in terms of compliance by, whatever it might be, fear of a fine, just want to do the right thing, we are now seeing more and more that the market is driving this by customers, whether it's commercial customers or the individuals sending slightly irritated emails about having their data having been misused.
Fascinating. Brilliant. Well, James, thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate that. Happy birthday to GDPR. Congratulations. You made it 1 year in. Well done.
With slightly less hair and a bigger waistline, but we made it.
You made it. Yeah, it's all good. It's been fascinating chatting about this. Of course, many other avenues to go down here. We're very interested in the data loss angle around this, and we do a lot of services around this, around the digital risk area. If you want to find out more, do read our white paper, Too Much Information, looking at the scale of data loss online. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Look forward to chatting more in the future.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you.
Cheers.
All right, and we're back with JC Cool and Philly D. What are y'all's Twitter handles? Plug your Twitter handles, boys.
The Collier Jam.
Collier Jam. Philly D.
I don't have Twitter. I don't have Twitter or Instagram.
Goodness.
Yeah.
Why?
I'm actually quite happy about that.
You got to get on it. We got to get the listeners hooked onto some Philly D Twitter.
on the old school Facebook, if Val really wants to.
Phil is all about that counterculture. So
yeah.
All right. Well, remember to go follow Digital Shadows on Twitter. Go follow Photon Research at photon_research, and subscribe to Shadow Talk on your favorite podcast platform, whatever you want to call it. The question of the week this week is, if you had to choose a favorite day of the week, excluding Friday and the weekend, what would it be and why?
So I have a lot of feelings about this. My personal kind of approach to the week is I work from home on a Thursday, and that means that Wednesday is the new Friday, because you finish Wednesday, you've gone 3 kind of hard days. You're going to work the next day remote. So even though you're going to be working hard, it's kind of a bit more relaxed, maybe that kind of extra hour in bed, and then you wake up again and it's Friday. So that's just the way I approach the week. I'm not sure if that means that Wednesday is my favorite day or Thursday, but I think they're both excellent days.
I was going to say, because if you go to sleep, it's still Thursday the next day. It's not Friday.
Yeah, but there's a sense of a bit more relaxation.
But then you got to come in. Then you got to come into the office again and all that.
Yeah, but then it's Friday. You're in the office and it's Friday.
I love that Wednesday's the new Friday, but I'm still going to work hard on Thursday.
We still work hard on Thursdays.
We're not really working hard.
I'm at home and I'm hauling, but it's just, you're kind of not having to do the commute, all of that stuff. So,
all right, fair.
New Fridays, you heard it here first.
All right, Philly.
There's a bank holiday Monday.
We'll count it since that is coming up next week for all of us.
Yeah, exactly. About 3 hours time.
How about you, Harrison?
Oh man, probably. All right, fine. Monday morning at 12:01 a.m. Because then it's that much closer to Monday morning.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that will do it from us for this week. Thank you, guests. Thank you, listeners. Talk to y'all next week.